Hi and welcome to The Mind of Skeptical Leftist, the show where I talk to a variety of people to promote and spread progressivism, left-wing politics, and critical thinking. Today I'm talking to Jay, aka Fallingrateofprophet. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So the reason that we got to do this is because there was a discussion online about somebody was defending North Korea in a comments thread that on a post I made.
Yes. And
various people had obviously a variety of opinions, but one of the opinions was that people who defend an autocracy like North Korea aren't leftists.
Yeah, I think that's true, depending on the grounds that you're defending them on. So, for example, if a war broke out between the United States and North Korea, or between China and North Korea, or whatever, if a military conflict broke out and you defend a place on purely anti-imperialist grounds, you maybe say this is in violation of international law, we disagree with this war happening, and so on. That's one basis for defense. And I think it would make sense on the left to defend the people who live in that place, regardless of what system they live under, if they're being subjected to imperialist war. That does not mean that you defend the system that they live under. And I think I think we've seen examples of that, where so for example, the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. It makes sense to call for, defending the Cuban people from that kind of invasion. Well, it doesn't mean that, you're necessarily approving of, Castro's dictatorship or something.
Right.
So, yeah, I think on that ground, it makes some sense. But the neo-Stalinists that we see around in a lot of these online discussions tend to conflate the two, and it's really frustrating to encounter, because they accuse you of defending the imperialist powers that might want to attack them if you so much as even question the systems that are in place there. Now, originally, I believe you used the word autocracy to describe North Korea. Is that? I got a laugh out of I forget who it was now who described it as a necrocracy. Because Kim Il-sung is the eternal president, and he's long dead. So I forget who said that, but it made me laugh a little, because there seems to be some truth in it. They had this bizarre cult of personality that I think has probably been taken to greater extremes than virtually anywhere in the world. It's hard. I think Stalin would blush at some of the excesses of the North Korean propaganda machine. So it's pretty bizarre. Silly. It is,
but one of the alternative views is that even though they have terrible ideas about who to, and they're making this error conflating the people with the system and whatnot, that those people, those tankies or what have you, are still leftists. So I wonder, why do you think they don't count as leftists?
Well, I think it really comes down to what goals you have. We have to ask, what are left goals, and do these people actually care about them in any way? Because I don't see much of any evidence of that. So, for example, a lot of the political discussion that we have about ideology in the last decade or so, I see it, a lot of it has been really framed by this political compass type of analysis where we talk about authoritarian left, libertarian left, authoritarian right, libertarian right. And I'm not saying that there's no basis for that. But what I am saying is that if you actually look at the goals that so many of these regimes and their supporters consistently espouse, I don't see how they fit into the authoritarian left part of it, because where's the left? I don't see it. When we look at those goals, okay, so for example, we don't just talk about things like, reducing economic inequality and things like that, because those goals can be anywhere. There was a sort of right-wing thinking that's kind of dead, but it's kind of dead. But there was this whole idea of noblesse oblige, like you have a noble obligation to help the poor. That idea on the right is essentially dead. They wanted to preserve the existing inequalities, but you had some obligation to help the poor through charity, through whatever. Right. And that, it's still very right wing. Okay. And if you look at the sorts of systems that are in place in these kind of countries, I think it actually bears a little more resemblance to that than it does to the left. So you have to ask how it plays out. In terms of internationalism, for example, they reject it. They come down firmly on the side of ultranationalism. I mean, is North Korea internationalist? No. Not in any way. Was Stalinism internationalist? No. We can say Marxism was certainly internationalist. We can certainly say that. We can say in a lot of ways Leninism still was, whatever flaws it may have had. It was still committed to the idea of international revolution. Right. It was committed to the idea that the at least in theory, not always in practice, but at least in theory, that whatever vanguard existed, that vanguard was to be a tribune for the oppressed, and that the oppressed peoples that existed, whether it was racial oppression or sexual oppression or whatever, in theory at least, and not always in practice, the idea was that you're standing up for the people who are downtrodden. Right. I see tankies in internet threads, and I see some of the discussion about race. I see some of the discussion about LGBT issues, about gender. And a lot of it to me is indistinguishable from neo-Nazis. Like, I'm not exaggerating here. Right. Like, they're pushing far right ideas around these things where LGBT people are seen as degenerates and so on. Like, what is left about that? Seriously, what is left about that? I don't see it, Yeah,
that's, I haven't seen so much about, I guess one could say that I've seen a lot of dismissive behaviors or attitudes around that stuff. Like they don't necessarily feel one way or the other. They just think that all identity politics is bullshit and that, transgender people are bougie or, stuff like that.
Yeah. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. We have, we have a long understanding of the way this has played out in our society, and a lot of people, really start that history at Stonewall, and since then, we consider that, the birth of the modern gay rights movement, which later became, more inclusive, LGBTQ plus. And we have that understanding, but we don't seem to have the understanding that, 100 years ago, the Bolsheviks legalized homosexuality. That was, right. It was very, I'm not going to say that they were progressive by today's standards, but by their own standards of the time. They threw out the old penal codes that existed under the Tsar, and they didn't really see the need to reinstate laws around things like that, which for its time was progressive. They sent representatives to international conferences on sexuality. A lot of the research that comes out of, understanding those sorts of issues in the early part of the 20th century came out of Germany, came out of Weimar, Germany. And, a lot of people associate the Nazis with burning books, but we rarely ask what books they were burning. They were burning books on essentially human sexuality, including
right.
That was the stuff that they were burning as degenerate. And I don't see from a lot of the neo tanky types much difference from that. I really don't. I don't see much difference from the book burning sort of attitudes. And I understand the identity politics thing, but are they really rejecting identity politics? I'm not sure if they are. I think they're just subscribing to an alternative version of it,
I've often said like that. Identity politics, depending on how you define it, exists in everything that is political, and everything is political.
It has to. It has to. I think there's a sort of vulgar identity politics that exists.
Right.
Like an oversimplified identity politics. But that doesn't mean that the whole is necessarily bad. And you look back, to those figures like Rosa Luxemburg and Clara Zetkin and the socialists and anarchists that were around at the time, Emma Goldman, and they talked about that in different terms, but they spoke of the, bourgeois feminism and that existed, and they differentiated between that and women's liberation through socialism and whatnot. So, the idea that, getting back to the main point, the idea that they're on the left, I have to ask, like, even economically, like sometimes, regardless of the feelings on identity politics, regardless of the feeling on any of that sort of thing, I guess we have to ask economically, are they on the left? There used to be the phenomenon, it existed around the world, but it was primarily the United States and Canada, of the one company town. And the one company towns that existed where people would come and they would work, and the company would provide all the housing, provide the amenities for the workers, recreation. The workers would be paid in scrip that was essentially worthless elsewhere, but you could spend it at the company store.
Right.
And basically, they would advertise themselves as if, this is the ideal place for working people to live, and recruit people as not in a necessarily utopian way, but in in a way that would, try to play up the most attractive features of coming to live in one of these towns.
Right.
And, if you put national borders and around one of these towns, okay, and you gave it a standing army, politically, what is different between that and North Korea, Stalinist Russia? Really? Yep. There is essentially very little difference. So I would argue that the USSR, once it really consolidated a full-on state capitalist economy, it was like a giant company town of a couple hundred million people, And, what is left about that? I think that the earlier you get, and the closer you get to the time of the revolution itself, there were certainly lots of features about it that were left. It was internationalist. They respected national self-determination. They, it was about breaking down barriers between workers in different places and so on. Now, but once it really became consolidated as like socialism in one country, as Stalin, as Stalinists like to put it, what's left about that? I don't see it. I don't see it in any issue. I don't see it in the identity politics issues. I don't see it in the economy. Really, how is it not just another company town?
That's something that I think. Okay, and obviously I'm an anarchist, so I kind of do. Personally think that any situation where you start off with a state consolidating power or whatever, then you're going to have that same similar effect, where the power, the money, the wealth, the resources, they all funnel upwards to a select group of people. And I mean that regardless of what, other left-wing people might think, or that is what Russia was. That is what Stalinist Russia was. It was money and power and wealth funneled up to the elites, and anybody who spoke up got murdered.
Pretty much. And I mean, even earlier than that, if you look at even under the latter days of the dictatorship under Lenin, it had really started to go in that direction. And I mean, there were, I'm not going to say that there's no difference though, because, you can actually read Lenin, whether you agree with him or not. I think he's a fantastic read. People should check him out because very quotable, and very quotable. And as a theoretician of capitalism, who understood imperialism and so on, is first rate in that sense. As someone who understood the need for organization, I think there's still a lot to learn. But I would argue that he got the economy wrong. That's where I think it messed up. And I guess if I were to put myself on the political spectrum, I would say kind of left Marxist. I tend to come out of that. For a number of years, I was a member of a group that came out of the Trotskyist tradition. Okay. But it I did leave over some political differences and whatnot. But I think that just looking at the idea, I guess, that comes from Marx, the idea that the economic base of a society has an overwhelming role in determining what the political superstructure of a society looks like. Right. Looking at that, you can have all of the progressive ideas you want about things like whether it's identity politics or internationalism or whatever. But eventually, that economic base is going to constrain you and push you in certain directions if you adopt a system that has flaws that push you away from that. So regardless of whatever attitudes you may have in those issues, and let's face it, when we're talking about early Bolshevism, it wasn't a monolith. There was a diversity of opinion on things like that, on things like women's liberation and things like international. There was a diversity of opinion, but eventually, as economic necessity catches up with you, and the only path forward that you see is consolidating state capitalism, you're going to start talking like state capitalist. You know, I mean, you might use some of the rhetoric of, Workers of the World Unite or whatever, but you're certainly not, practicing it to much, if any, degree. So if it's true that the economic base of a society, the mode of production, plays a huge role in determining what the political superstructure of a society looks like, then we would expect a state capitalist system to turn out a certain way. We would expect private capitalism to turn out a certain way. We would expect feudalism to turn out a certain way, So that, I think is really the thing that we need to look at is the economics of it and ask whether these people got it right. I see a lot of the debate online, and this is where we may disagree. We may diverge on this, as you identify as an anarchist. I see a lot of the debate online coming down to the issue of libertarianism versus authoritarianism. Whereas I see a lot of the divergence happening around issues of economic organization, whether it's state control or worker control,
Right. Yeah.
So that's, I think we probably arrive at a very similar place. We probably do. But I think that we probably come at it from, a different angle. We mentioned, Rosa Luxemburg. I don't think, looking at her ideas, and her writings and what she advocated and whatnot, I don't think that she would necessarily fit the bill for what we would call libertarian left if we're going if we're going in the direction that she was opposed to the state, because she wasn't. Right. I mean, she wanted the eventual abolition of it, of course, but she wasn't, opposed to using the state. But it was a very different conception of the state than, say, what came in Russia. And you can read her writings about it. And basically, that's kind of where I come from in terms of my analysis of that whole thing. Is I look at what she wrote, and I try to do my own thinking on it as well. But I find that more often than not, I agree with her praise of what happened in the Russian Revolution, and I agree with her harsh criticisms of what happened. Excuse me. So,
yeah, that's one of those things, like talking to like somebody who identifies as a pro-state socialist. I often make the case that even though I'm an anarchist and we say that we are anti any state, right? That doesn't mean that we're anti governance as a concept, right? Like we still need to organize our society in a certain way, and that could be considered governance and I mean, it's hard to, it depends on what you mean by these things too, right?
Yeah, it does. It does. And historically, we've seen examples of that. I think of the Iroquois Confederacy, which I think that we could say was like a government without a state. It was, it was a series of communities that came together under political agreement, but there was no, overarching state structure holding it in place. In a way that I've heard some discussion about that may have acted as some kind of inspiration for the American Revolution. I don't really know about that, but I do know that there are other models that we can look at where there's governance, not necessarily a centralized state, but not necessarily abdication of the concept of authority either. Like the Zapatistas, for example.
Right.
They're an example of that, I would say. They do hold a certain degree of authority, but it's not like a centralized state structure in the sense that we would identify with capitalism. Rojava is another one, where it's not a centralized state with a bureaucracy and so on, but it's not really a free for all either, if you know what I'm saying.
Right. Yeah. Actually, because of the way they have to stay in defense of themselves all the time, they have a pretty rigid social order, right? Mm-hmm. With like a military that is, careful and rigid. They have to be to some degree because they're defending themselves against the surrounding area. But yeah, they like you say, they don't have like per se a leader who rules over, like who leads the way a president rules,
Yeah, and the question that I keep coming back to, and I think there are a lot of bad faith arguments about this. So, for example, I've seen so many online threads with the neo-Stalinist types, the tankies, where they quote Engels' essay on authority. And I've seen a lot of bad faith arguments around this. But I also think that Engels had a point in that, revolution can be a very authoritarian thing if you look at the dynamics of, one class fighting another. Yeah, in that sense. But there are a lot of bad faith arguments around it as well, where it becomes used to justify any sort of state tyranny. So they'll use Engels' essay to justify, the Great Leap Forward, or you know what I'm saying. Like those are just terrible arguments.
Yeah,
but right. I do think there's a certain point, and the point that I keep coming back to. I don't consider myself an anarchist, but I certainly open to anarchist ideas. And the thing that I keep coming back to is just the question of monopoly of arms. That is, do you want to allow the other side to arm? And I would argue no.
Right.
And there is an argument. I'm not saying that it's the only way to look at it, but there is an argument that says that the state, the existence of the state, is essentially just enforcement of the monopoly of arms, enforcement of a monopoly of violence. And in that sense, I would want revolutionary forces to have that monopoly. But that doesn't mean that you want, centralized bureaucracy with, courts and all that stuff.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying, right? Like, I think it's too easy to jump from one to the other. And if we're talking about the neo-Stalinist types that we encounter online, the tankies, they make these sorts of arguments so often where whether you're an anarchist or whether you're just question the authority of these state capitalist regimes or whatever, that is seen as essentially, betraying the chances of a revolution. You're going to let private capitalism and imperialism walk all over you because you don't accept their authority over things. And that's just a really bad faith argument because, are they the only options? Is this?
I would argue no.
No, I would argue no as well. I would argue definitely not. And I think that question of anarchism, in a lot of ways, I think it comes down to the way I see it personally is if you say you aren't an anarchist, are you happy about that? Are you happy about it? And here's what I mean, okay? I don't necessarily consider myself an anarchist, but I would love to be proven wrong. I would absolutely love to be proven wrong about that, because if I'm proven wrong, that means that we don't need these institutions that have been associated historically and continue to have so many problems around organizing them, state structures and stuff. If it's hard to look at the world, whether today or historically, and argue that those sorts of structures have not had massive problems.
Right, okay?
Right. It's hard to. If you view them as an unfortunate necessity in a time of revolution, that's one thing. If you view them as desirable,
that's a whole other thing.
We got major issues because they're not desirable at absolute best. At absolute best, and this would probably be the divide between anarchism and classical Marxism, is that they're an unfortunate necessity, basically legacy software that you've you come to inherit, and then eventually you want to clear it off your system. Yeah. But I don't see the neo-Stalinist types arguing in that way at all. I see them as seeing these types of structures as inherently desirable.
Right. Which I think gives the I don't want to say the lie to it, but it gives that's where the authoritarianism is, right? Like that's where that defense of Stalin comes from, or the North Korea. They want to have a state that dominates the citizens while espousing citizens' power, I guess, as a rhetoric.
Yeah, and that's all it is. It's rhetoric. And they want to regulate basically every facet of people's lives. There's actually something I would like to read if I can find it on my phone here. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
There's something that I don't think that has necessarily been engaged with enough, and it's just, it's a couple paragraphs really that Marx wrote. Okay, Marx wrote in his day as a criticism of some of the other tendencies that were emerging around the workers' movements. And the one that he was very harshly critical of, he called barracks communism.
Okay.
And he says, he says, what a beautiful model of barrack room communism. Here you have it all. Communal eating, communal sleeping, assessors and offices regulating education, production, consumption, in a word, all social activity, and to crown all, our committee, anonymous and unknown to anyone, as the supreme director. This is indeed the purest anti-authoritarianism. So, yeah. So, but I think that little snippet of Marx, and Marx is very quotable. If we want to talk about quotable historical figures, that little snippet has something that is really interesting because it even in his day, he called out this notion of people who wanted every facet of the working class's life to be harshly regulated.
Right.
And that's eventually what emerged, in these places. I would argue that it has much more in common with what he called barracks communism than anything that, he or Engels advocated, really. That would be my assertion. And I have to ask why. Like, what is attractive about this? I understand that when you live in a society that is messing things up as badly as ours is, I understand that there is an attraction to alternatives. Now, of course, you're gonna want to look around for alternatives, but are those alternatives? Are they any better at the at the things that
There's a bit of a saying like around, this makes me think of it, around anarchist circles is even like Soviet cops are still cops.
Yeah.
Right. So the idea that we can have a freer society by rigidly structuring the daily lives of working people, it seems counterintuitive to me.
It is completely counterintuitive. It is completely counterintuitive. And again, I think if we're talking about just authoritarianism in the strictest sense, I would come down on the side of a revolution needs to enforce monopoly of arms. At least, until you've, dealt with counter-revolution. I would come down on that side. That doesn't mean that I would come down on the side of, the KGB, or,
right.
the Cheka under Lenin, for that matter. They committed horrible atrocities. Okay.
Yeah.
There's no doubt. Or Soviet cops or whoever you want to say, but I think it is possible to differentiate between them. I'm sure that there's probably some, maybe yourself or maybe some anarchist listener out there is probably going, who is this authoritarian you're talking to? But I think that there is a real difference. And for me, again, I keep coming back to the economy. I keep coming back to the idea of the economy being the determining factor here. Do you remember? It's about I think 2008, 2009, somewhere in there. I think it was 2009.
Okay.
There was this issue of Newsweek. There was this issue of Newsweek, and on the cover there was a red hand shaking a blue hand, and it said something like, "We are all socialists now." Do you recall this?
I do not remember that at all.
Okay. Well, what it was, basically, it was a cover story on Newsweek, and the idea was that because there was such heavy state intervention in the economy after the crash of 2008, that basically the old arguments about neoliberalism and hands-off economics no longer stood, and now everybody's a socialist because we're pushing for state intervention.
Because it's not laissez-faire capitalism.
That's right. Yeah, because there's bailouts and partial nationalizations and so on. And this sort of thinking has really penetrated our consciousness, whether it's under capitalism or whether we're talking about revolutionary alternatives or what. The idea that state intervention equals socialism. Whatever the state does, that's socialism.
Right.
And that's a real prejudice that we have to face up to. Yeah. And I don't agree with it. And it was pretty clear, again, if you read Marx and Engels, they didn't agree with it either. Especially later on. Like Engels, for example, I was just, pulling up a couple quotes there while I was on my phone there. What Engels wrote was that when you have nationalization, that doesn't mean that it's socialism. And a lot of the arguments on the left coming from the defenders of North Korea or the defenders of China or the USSR or whatever, they're arguing it is socialism because it is the state. Or, at least, right. at least impartial, that it's socialism. But, there's a quote here. I just gotta, oops. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Here we go. This is Engels. Okay. The modern state, no matter what its form, is essentially a capitalist machine, the state of the capitalists, the ideal personification of the total national capital. The more it proceeds to taking over of productive forces, the more does it actually become the national capitalist, the more citizens does it exploit. Yep. The workers remain wage workers, proletarians. Yep. The capitalist relation is not done away with. That is so radically different. Just that quote is so radically different outlook than what I see coming from the left.
Right.
in these, because I mean that's how we got drawn into this discussion in the first place, was just reacting to these sorts of ridiculous online tanky types, with their gulag memes and their, oh my god, like,
although I gotta love a gulag meme though. They're funny as hell.
I just shake my head. I'm like, man, but yeah, no, really, it seems that they cannot, it seems to me that they're about as radical as Newsweek magazine, in that they cannot distinguish between state intervention and state ownership and socialism. Now, that quote that I just shared was Engels, and what's interesting though is that he doesn't argue against nationalization. He goes on later, but it's not nationalization in terms of control of the centralized control. He goes on to argue that it's under the control of the working class that we can overcome the problems that state capitalism creates. And that is very different than what happened in practice in revolution, because there was very little worker control and eventually none,
Yeah.
So when you
all right. So where can people find your content online?
I have a YouTube channel. It's kind of moribund. I think I only posted 1 or 2 videos. So I posted a rant about basic income, which I'm against. I think it's a neoliberal trap.
That is something we will have to discuss another day.
I would love to. But I have a video there about that, and I have another one. I can't remember if it's still up or if I pulled it down. But there's not much content. But it's on YouTube. The YouTube channel is Fallingrateofprophet, just like my handle on here.
Perfect.
And there's nothing fancy about the content. There's no production value whatsoever. It's literally me rambling into a camera. That's what it consists of. And
that's all right.
So I hope to eventually get around to doing more. I do hope that people will check out what is there. on the
For
YouTube,
sure.
and hopefully enjoy and learn something from it.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me.